Okay, let's get started. Second video of the year, second video of our series, What Can I Learn From? And for today, and this is trying to follow some of the teachings, some of the experiences I gathered with Saineretam. This week, we're going to try to follow that same path and see if we can gain a little more courage in terms of our use of color, for sure, but also composition. This is going to be super key today. So the artist for this week is going to be MORTEZA KHAKSHOOR. Forgive me, Morteza, if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. I have been a fan of Morteza's work for years. I am somebody who is incredibly sensitive to great drawing, great design, and I think Morteza is just a tremendous draftsperson. I think there's so much embedded, fantastic drawing underneath his work that I relish it. That's one of the things that I enjoy the most. I think because I was trained as an illustrator, because I was, born to love comic books, I've always just been attracted to good drawing, to strong drawing, to drawing that can communicate. I think that sometimes we try to define good drawing in a very academic context. And by that I mean if we're able to faithfully translate nature with our own drawing. So a lot of times people think of great drawing as drawing that exhibits good perspective, or drawing that exhibits good proportions when dealing with a human figure, or drawing that shows how much you know about anatomy and gesture. All of those things I appreciate, but with age, I've also noticed that drawing is just a powerful tool for communication. It is probably the most raw, the most honest tool in terms of visually trying to convey something. Think about it. If we go back and place ourselves in a cave hundreds of thousands of years ago, we probably would have taken just a piece of rock, a pigment, and just kind of scraped it and dragged it on top of a stone so that we could produce some primitive mark making. And I think that what was true and instinctual and primal back then, it's still very much true nowadays. There is nothing quite as honest as pure mark making. And I do think Morteza's work exhibits that beautifully. His drawings show that, his etchings show that, and I think that in attempting to find, from the outside looking in, obviously, Morteza's DNA in past art history, I would say that you could find it in Picasso. I think there's a little bit of Picasso in all of us. I mean, Picasso tried so many things in terms of developing a visual language that chances are that there's some aspect of what he did that quietly permeates our work. So Picasso for sure. In terms of color work, there is obviously an expressionist undertone to what he does. Maybe some Kirchner, and maybe a not so heavy Beckman and David Park. I think David Park's an absolute genius, and perhaps we'll have future videos where we speak about him. But yeah, I think a lot of the DNA is there. Also, last but not least, a bit of Bonnard in composition. I have very seldom seen artists that were as daring as Bonnard was in composition. And I think Morteza is very, very conscious of pushing the limits in a very elegant way in terms of composition. And I want to stop here and talk a little bit about composition because I do think that it is an aspect of Morteza's work that is just deeply fascinating to me. That's where I land with his work. I adore his drawing. I think his color choices are brilliant, but what just glues my eyes to his work is his composition. And I think the reason why I love it is because I think there's a ton of things that are considered to be wrong that are present in his work. So what do I mean by wrong? Because that's a very difficult term to define in art, in any sort of art form. When I say wrong, I think has to do with my own training. I was trained as an illustrator, so the rules for composition and design for illustration haven't really changed that much from, let's say, a century ago. Picture making, even though you could argue that it's far more dynamic now, it still kind of follows basic rules of composition. And when you think about it, if your goal is to communicate a story, if your goal is to present a message as clearly as you can, then the ease of reading that picture is paramount. When presenting a narrative. It could be more of an abstract narrative, or it could be more of an explicit narrative. But when presenting that to the viewer, when trying to communicate a message to the viewer, clarity should be the most important aspect of your painting. The observer should know exactly what they're looking at, and you should be able to command the viewer's gaze with authority. Usually a viewer that spends time questioning if a shape should have been presented that way, or if a choreography of forms feels unsettling, if those are the responses that you're inspiring with your picture, it means that perhaps we as viewers are spending too much energy in questioning a lot of the things that are presented to us, instead of just accepting the message and being able to gather enough information so you can go along for the ride. What is incredibly important is to have like an assured sense that the message that you were trying to convey flows seamlessly towards your viewer. And the manner in which we traditionally attempted to create that imperceptible flow of visual information was by following certain rules that appeared to be in nature that made picture reading, let's call it, pleasant. So historically, we have followed ways of disposing forms, of organizing shapes within a picture plane where our human eye doesn't feel uneasy when it tries to consume that information. For example, as an aid in composition, I was suggested to look at a bunch of Andrew Loomis books. And I remember later on looking at other books on sequential art and storyboarding, and I actually noticed that a lot of the things that were true for those Loomis books was the same torch that was carried by a lot of these books that spoke about current storyboarding and current visual storytelling. So that kind of gives you an idea that in terms of more traditional illustration and visual storytelling, so let's say comic books, graphic novels, a lot of these rules still apply. So in many ways, composition, if you look at it traditionally, has remained, I'm not going to say stagnant, because it obviously has proven to be something that's incredibly useful. Again, a very powerful communicative tool. But I think what's great about painting, and I'm not going to say this is exclusive to painting, because it's very hard nowadays to talk about things that are exclusive to one art form over the others. But what I think is very present in painting is the ability to generate a space of reflection that can bend the rules beautifully. And what painting in particular actually takes advantage of is the fact that it is working within this notion of two-dimensionality. So what that means is that we work on a substrate, be it a piece of paper or a cardboard or a piece of stretched canvas or linen. And even though it's a three-dimensional object, paper, cardboard, linen, they're all real-world objects. They're three-dimensional. As soon as we paint on them, there is this kind of weird transformation that happens where they become a two-dimensional picture plane. And that's actually quite fantastic because it generates boundaries. Now, a lot of people think that that is constricting, that because there is a confined space where you have to work in, that means that everything has to happen within that tight playing field. There's people that feel almost claustrophobic when working on something that is two-dimensional, and it prompts them to try to break the picture plane and work three-dimensionally or find other alternatives for how they want to present their work. But I think that something that is inherent to the nature of traditional painting can also be an amazing invitation to break the rules that are native to two-dimensionality. And I think Morteza does that brilliantly. I think, like I said before, he has a little bit of that David Park DNA, because David Park was also doing a little bit of this decades ago. But I think Morteza does it in such an elegant way that things that should generate an enormous amount of tension in the viewer that are present almost always in Morteza's work, for some reason, we don't understand them as obstacles. We don't see them as something that is blocking our path when trying to traverse through an image. That, to me, is almost like alchemy. That's something magical. And it proves, and I think this is one of Morteza's biggest achievement with his work, it proves that recognizing how to translate intent into formal decisions when picture making is one of the most impressive tools that we can learn when we decide to be painters. So what does that mean, intent, and how does that allow us to break rules? Well, I think in Morteza's case, it is about the ability to present something with absolute certainty, with absolute confidence. When he designs a picture, there are many times where you think forms are just extending themselves, almost like overextending themselves, so that they can cover each margin of this two-dimensional plane. They want to acknowledge the fact that there's an edge of the paper present. Forms kind of feel the proximity of those edges of the substrate. And the reason that it works is because of that, because there's almost like a consciousness within the artwork that is telling the viewer, I know how far I can go. I know how far I'm extending myself in this flat earth of a picture plane. And I know the urgency of feeling like I'm going to go over the edge. But I'm not going to use that as borders that I can't cross. I'm going to use it instead as something that generates so much tension that I'm going to empower that tension. I'm going to design knowing that that tension is available there for me to use. And again, I think he does that brilliantly. So it's not only about the tension that is part of the inside of the picture plane and how it relates to the edges of the picture plane. No, it's not only that. He's also aware of tangents. So what I mean by that is that he's also aware of where forms meet. And this is like a really big thing when thinking about visually communicating something. There is a way in which you can dispose forms where each one of those shapes and forms can read clearly and nicely, and you can flow from one form to the other, and you can control the pace in which you go from one shape to the next. That is usually what happens in traditional great composition. You're always in control. Now, what you don't want to happen in traditional composition is that you quickly kind of slip from one shape to the next and you start generating connections that shouldn't really be there. And those connections may prove to be harmful in terms of determining scale or in terms of determining depth. So we have to be super, super careful when organizing our shapes within the picture plane. Now, everything that you read about tangents and all the red flags associated with them and those big X marks when they tell you should do this and never do this. There are so many wonderful things that are wrong in Morteza's work that it goes to show you rules are important. And they certainly have proven to be useful throughout history in terms of visually communicating messages, but they can be broken. And they just require talented, imaginative, daring people to do so. But as soon as you realize that so many traditional rules are broken and still the picture has power to communicate, you realize how painting allows you, almost like invites you to question all those things, because it's giving you the opportunity to create a playground, to generate your own rules that don't have to abide by natural law. Your painting doesn't have to feel like it has to obey the nature that we know, the nature that we experience. It doesn't. It is your world. These are your rules to bend and to present to the viewer in infinite manners. That is the power that we have, but that's also a great responsibility because we're also meant to be critical and reflective about what happens when those rules are bent. And I think that Morteza's work is just a perfect example of the subtle shifting that can be made within a picture plane that ultimately enhances the experience the viewer has when they become active observers. So once again, what does that mean for me? I was taught to do things right. I was taught to respect the boundaries of my picture plane, and I was taught to avoid unnecessary tension created by awkwardly designed tangents. So what that means for me is that when attempting to open up and let a lot of the amazing things that are happening in Morteza's work permeate my work, there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen. A ton of questioning a lot of the things that I was taught to avoid like the plague. So when I started to do this painting, I knew I couldn't just paint directly on top of my surface and find my way through composition. I knew I had to draw in a very conscious way And I knew I had to understand drawing as a tool that was going to help me organize my picture plane in ways that are not really familiar to me. That's why you saw me with my water miscible color pencil go for my drawing and really begin to investigate the placement and the choreography and the gesture of those big shapes. I think that part was essential. Identifying that my drawing had to be a tool that could help me extract a little bit the elements that had to do with design and composition so that I could focus in on them on a separate layer, and then I could think of how to heighten those choices with the colors that I was going to pick. Now, when I felt comfortable about my design choices, I then approached the painting with a lot of freedom. And I think what I mean by freedom is that I usually try to generate harmonies with the colors that I pick. So I usually don't give myself the chance to just understand areas of the painting as very separate color masses. But when I started this painting, I was like, let's give this a shot. And so it meant that I was going to think of different shapes as having very different local colors. So colors that chromatically wouldn't really relate to the colors that were surrounding them. And I think I was able to do that with a bit of freedom because I think the shapes were strong enough to hold together, to glue together such jarring color choices. This was a really tough painting for me to do. There's a lot of misproportion in the figure. There's a lot of stretching of forms, compressing of forms. There's a lot of forms that I treated in an angular fashion. There's a lot of other forms that I treated in a curvy linear way. So I think there's quietly a ton of dynamism in there, and all of it framed under this consciousness, this heightened consciousness of my boundaries. I think that was really important, that if I was going to try to activate all the edges of my substrate, I needed to understand that the figure, in this case Fer, was going to become a character that kind of had sentience about the boundaries that made up her two-dimensional little window into her world. I think that was absolutely essential. I'm super happy with it. I was questioning tons of things while I was painting it, but I think it was a great effort. I think it was a step in the wrong direction, and I loved it. And I want to see if I can explore this further. I'm going to try to see if throughout this year I can search for artists that are, yes, artists that I respect and that I enjoy. I think that that's the most important thing, firstly. But I think I need to look for artists that make me question everything that I know and open doors for me, because I think that that's the most wonderful thing to do when you meet an artist that you respect, that they show you their world and you realize how different a world it is from the one that you have depicted for so many years. That's going to be it for today. We'll see you next week where we continue our series of What Can We Learn From? Thank you. Bye.